bobcat appeared out of nowhere and kept returning, so the man started leaving food outside, never imagining that one small act of kindness would change everything. Before long, the bobcat began showing up with company. Other bobcats, including a female. Then came the kittens. The numbers exploded so fast it left him stunned. In what felt like no time at all, he wasn't just seeing a bobcat anymore. He was living beside an entire hidden family tucked just beyond his home. Soon, his property looked downright overrun. At least 20 wild bobcats sprawled across the patio furniture like they owned the place. And the strangest part? They weren't acting wild at all. They sat shoulder to shoulder, staring intently through the glass. But why would solitary predators gather like this? And what exactly were they waiting for? Stick around, because the truth behind this wild meeting is far stranger and much funnier than you could ever imagine. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning began with the kind of bright, crystalline clarity that only an early autumn day in the Pacific Northwest could offer. The sun crested the towering Douglas firs, casting sharp, brilliant beams of light across the dew-soaked lawn of Arthur Pendleton's remote property. Every blade of grass seemed to hold a tiny, glittering prism, and the air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and damp earth. It was a morning that demanded wide-open eyes and a steaming cup of dark roast coffee. Arthur, a retired high school history teacher with a penchant for quiet mornings, sat in his favorite armchair by the sliding glass patio door. Beside him sat Barnaby, a domestic tabby cat of substantial girth and unearned confidence. Barnaby was the self-appointed guardian of the glass door, a sentinel who spent his days glaring at squirrels and chattering at blue jays. But on this particular brilliantly lit morning, Barnaby was not chattering. He was frozen. His tail was puffed into a bristling bottle brush, and his nose was pressed so hard against the glass that it left a small, foggy circle. Arthur lowered his coffee mug and followed the tabby's gaze. There, sitting perfectly still in the center of the sun-drenched patio, was a wild bobcat. For anyone familiar with wildlife rehabilitation and conservation, the sight of a lynx rufus in broad daylight is a rare and spectacular event. This specimen was magnificent. The morning light caught the rich, tawny gold of its coat, highlighting the stark black rosettes and bars that provided perfect camouflage in the dappled forest shadows. Its facial ruff flared outward, giving it the appearance of a distinguished, heavily side-burned Victorian gentleman, and the signature black tufts on the tips of its ears twitched with microscopic precision, acting as biological satellite dishes to capture the faintest sounds of the forest. The bobcat stared at Barnaby. Barnaby stared at the bobcat. Arthur, acting on a sudden, completely unscientific and purely sentimental impulse, did something any seasoned wildlife expert would advise against. He opened the sliding door just a crack and tossed out a small, leftover piece of baked chicken from his refrigerator. The bobcat flinched, its powerful hind legs tensing like coiled springs. But the scent of the meat overrode its natural caution. It crept forward, its oversized, snowshoe-like paws making absolutely no sound on the concrete. It snatched the chicken, offered Arthur a long, unblinking look with its striking amber eyes, and vanished into the dense underbrush with the phantom-like grace unique to apex predators. Arthur chuckled, took a sip of his coffee, and thought nothing more of it. He assumed it was a fleeting encounter, a small story to tell at the local diner. He did not realize that this simple, misguided act of kindness was about to turn his quiet retirement into a wildly chaotic, spectacularly heartwarming adventure. In the wild, bobcats are fiercely solitary creatures. They maintain strict territories, marking their boundaries with scent and avoiding each other except during the brief, noisy mating season. They are the elusive ghosts of the American wilderness. However, wildlife biology is a science of rules, and animals are notorious for breaking them when exceptional circumstances arise. 3 days later, the bright morning routine repeated itself. Arthur sat with his coffee. Barnaby stood guard at the glass. But this time, the original bobcat, whom Arthur had affectionately dubbed Rufus, did not return alone. Standing just behind Rufus was a smaller, sleeker female. She had a lighter coat, almost silvery gray in the crisp morning light, and her eyes were a sharp, pale yellow. "Well, Barnaby," Arthur murmured, adjusting his glasses. "It seems Rufus has brought a date to the diner." Feeling a sudden sense of hospitable duty, Arthur tossed out 2 pieces of chicken. The pair accepted the offering, retreating to the edge of the woods to eat. By the end of the 2nd week, the situation began to escalate with mathematical impossibility. The female, who had grown surprisingly comfortable with the patio layout, emerged from the ferns one morning, followed by a tumbling, chaotic line of 4 fluffy, spotty kittens. They were impossibly cute, looking like overgrown, angry house kittens with comically large feet and stubby little tails. The kittens had no concept of stealth. They tackled each other on the patio, wrestled over fallen leaves, and attempted to climb the decorative cedar pillars of Arthur's porch. And then, the impossible happened. The word, somehow, spread through the forest. Perhaps it was the abundance of a new food source, or perhaps there was an ecological shift happening deeper in the woods. But more bobcats began to arrive. They came in 1s and 2s. Young, lanky transients looking for territory. Older, battle-scarred males missing chunks of their ear tufts, and more females with litters of various ages. One unforgettable morning, Arthur walked into his living room to find Barnaby sitting rigid on the welcome mat. Arthur looked out the glass door and stopped dead in his tracks. The entire patio was covered in wild cats. There were at least 20 of them. They were sitting on the doormat, lounging on the outdoor patio furniture, perching on the railing, and sitting patiently on the concrete. They all stared through the glass, their unblinking feral eyes fixed intently on Barnaby. The domestic tabby sat on the inside of the glass, looking out at the sprawling, wild family with a mixture of terror and profound, ego-inflating awe. Barnaby had accidentally become the tiny indoor king of a bobcat empire. When an elderly man suddenly finds his property annexed by 24 wild predators, he has a few choices. He can call the authorities, he can panic, or he can pull up a chair and watch the greatest show on Earth. Arthur chose the latter. As the days turned into weeks, Arthur began to recognize the distinct personalities of his unexpected guests. Despite their uniform spots and stubby tails, no 2 bobcats were alike. He began keeping a journal, documenting their behaviors with the keen eye of an amateur behaviorist. Rufus, the pioneer, the original visitor. Rufus was the stoic elder statesman of the group. He rarely engaged in the foolishness of the younger cats, preferring to sit on the highest point of Arthur's brick barbecue grill, surveying the yard with regal indifference. Madame Murder Mittens, the sleek, silvery female who had first accompanied Rufus. She was fiercely protective of her kittens and possessed a gaze that made Arthur feel the sudden urge to apologize for things he hadn't even done. She was the undisputed matriarch of the patio. The professor, a young male with a surprisingly analytical mind. The professor was fascinated by human mechanics. He spent hours intensely studying the rotating lawn sprinkler, trying to calculate the exact trajectory of the water before inevitably misjudging it and getting blasted in the face, sending him scrambling into the bushes with an offended yowl. Sir Fluffs-a-Lot, a juvenile male whose winter coat had come in entirely too fast, making him look less like a sleek hunter and more like a deeply angry Ottoman. He was clumsy, frequently missing jumps and pretending he meant to land face first in the rhododendron bush. The garden gnome annihilator, an unnamed kitten whose sole purpose in life was to wage a brutal, unyielding war against a ceramic gnome Arthur kept near the hydrangeas. The kitten would stalk the inanimate object for hours, wiggling its hindquarters before launching a devastating pounce, batting the gnome into the dirt and strutting away victorious. The patio became a theater of the absurd. Arthur spent hours watching apex predators get entirely befuddled by a backyard hammock. A group of 3 juveniles once spent an entire afternoon trying to figure out how to sleep in it, continually tipping it over and spilling themselves onto the grass like spotted marbles. Another time, Arthur left an empty Amazon delivery box on the porch. Within minutes, a heated territorial dispute erupted. Because, as any wildlife expert will tell you, the biological imperative that dictates if I fits, I sits is universal across all feline species, regardless of whether they weigh 10 pounds or 40. Ultimately, Madame Murder Mittens claimed the box, squeezing her formidable bulk into the corrugated cardboard and daring anyone to challenge her. As autumn deepened, the crisp mornings gave way to biting, frosty nights. The bright, clear days began to shorten, and the chill of the coming winter settled over the Pacific Northwest. Arthur knew that feeding wildlife could create dangerous dependencies, and he had entirely stopped handing out rotisserie chicken after realizing the sheer volume of cats on his property. Yet the Bobcats did not leave. They had claimed the perimeter of his home as their own. With the temperature dropping, Arthur's conscience gnawed at him. He couldn't bring them inside. They were wild animals, equipped with razor-sharp claws, bone-crushing jaw pressure, and a natural instinct to shred upholstery. But he couldn't leave them entirely to the mercy of the freezing rain. He decided to turn his detached 2-car garage into a temporary shelter. Drawing on an old stack of nature magazines and a newfound dedication to understanding Lynx rufus ecology, Arthur went to work. He cracked the side door of the garage just enough for the cats to slip through. Inside, he built an intricate network of high perches using old 2x4s and plywood. Bobcats, he had learned, feel safest when they are elevated, allowing them to survey their surroundings. He scattered thick layers of cedar shavings on the concrete floor to absorb moisture and provide insulation. He brought in sturdy, hollow logs from the woods to serve as hiding spots. He even installed a small, safe heating lamp in one corner, casting a dim, comforting glow over a pile of old woolen blankets. He did not provide food inside the garage. He wanted them to continue hunting the local rodent population. But he did provide a large, heated water bowl that wouldn't freeze overnight. The first night he opened the sanctuary, he watched through the window of his house. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just past midnight, the shadowy silhouette of Rufus slipped through the cracked door. A few moments later, Madame Murder Mittens herded her kittens inside. By morning, the garage was a slumbering, purring mass of spotted fur. Arthur had inadvertently created the world's most dangerous, most adorable bed and breakfast. Among the wild hearts that took refuge in the garage, one commanded Arthur's attention above all others. It was the smallest kitten of Madame Murder Mittens' litter. Arthur named him Pip. Pip was the runt. While his siblings grew rapidly, putting on muscle and developing the broad, powerful shoulders necessary for taking down prey, Pip remained painfully small. His legs were a little too spindly, his ear tufts were virtually non-existent, and he had a tragic, persistent sneeze that made him sound like a tiny, punctured tire. In the wild, the rule of survival is harsh and unforgiving. Runts rarely make it through their first winter. They are outcompeted for milk, they struggle to keep up with the nomadic movements of the mother, and they are highly vulnerable to other predators, including owls and coyotes. Arthur watched Pip with a heavy heart. He saw the larger kittens push Pip away from the warmest spots under the heat lamp. He saw Pip stumble when trying to leap onto the lowest plywood perch, falling clumsily into the cedar shavings while his siblings watched from above. A lesser man might have intervened directly, scooping the kitten up and bringing him into the house. But Arthur respected the boundary between man and nature. He knew that to handle Pip would be to sever the kitten's wild instincts entirely. Instead, Arthur decided to level the playing field. He began strategically placing small wooden ramps leading up to the perches inside the garage. When he saw Pip struggling to climb, he would quietly slide a ramp into place, allowing the tiny bobcat to march proudly up to the high ground. When a family of field mice made the fatal mistake of nesting behind Arthur's lawnmower in the corner of the garage, Arthur made sure Pip got the first crack at them. He would intentionally block the paths of the larger kittens with a broom, giving Pip the solitary opportunity to practice his hunting skills. It was a slow, arduous process. Pip's first attempt at hunting resulted in the tiny bobcat getting spectacularly outmaneuvered by a mouse half his size, leaving Pip to sneeze indignantly into the dust. But Arthur didn't give up, and neither did Pip. The little bobcat possessed a tenacity that far outweighed his size. He spent hours practicing his pounce on blowing leaves outside. He learned to use his smaller stature to his advantage, hiding in spaces his bulkier siblings couldn't reach, waiting in ambush. One bitterly cold evening in late January, Arthur was watching the garage through a pair of binoculars from his kitchen window. A large, fat wood rat had wandered into the sanctuary, drawn by the warmth. Sir Fluffs-a-Lot made a clumsy dive for it and missed, crashing into a stack of empty flower pots. The rat scrambled toward the dark corner under the workbench. Suddenly, a tiny silver blur launched from the shadows. It was Pip. With perfect form, the little runt executed a textbook stalk and pounce, pinning the large rat with shocking precision. The other kittens stopped and stared. Madame Murder Mittens looked down from the highest perch, offering a low, rumbling chuff of approval. Pip stood tall over his prize, his chest puffed out, looking every bit the fierce, untamed hunter he was born to be. Arthur lowered his binoculars, a wide smile spreading across his weathered face. The weakest link had forged himself into iron. As winter thawed into a glorious blooming spring, Arthur found himself plagued by a nagging question. Why were they all here? He had stopped feeding them months ago. The garage was comfortable, yes, but wild bobcats are deeply territorial. Putting 20 of them in close proximity should have resulted in endless, violent turf wars. Yet, aside from minor squabbles over the Amazon box, they lived in remarkable harmony. They lingered in the yard, rolling in the grass, purring loudly, and staring adoringly through the glass door at Barnaby. Arthur began to suspect something was deeply wrong with the local ecosystem. Had a logging company destroyed their natural denning grounds miles away? Had a forest fire pushed them out of the mountains? He spent days reading local environmental reports, searching for a logical explanation for this unprecedented feline gathering. The truth, however, was far stranger, far funnier, and entirely Arthur's fault. It started when Arthur noticed the professor, the analytical young male, rolling frantically in a patch of dirt near the edge of the vegetable garden. The bobcat was acting completely unhinged. He was drooling, kicking his heavy back legs in the air and making a bizarre, high-pitched chirping sound. Soon, Sir Fluffsalot joined him, burying his face in the dirt and purring so loudly it sounded like an idling diesel engine. Arthur walked out to the garden, gently shooing the heavily intoxicated apex predators away. He knelt down and inspected the soil. Growing wildly out of control, spreading like a weed through the rich, untended soil of his abandoned vegetable patch, was a massive, sprawling thicket of Nepeta cataria. Catnip. Arthur's mind raced back to 3 years ago. He had ordered an ultra-premium, highly potent heirloom variety of organic catnip seeds from a specialty catalog, intending to grow a small pot for Barnaby. He had carelessly tossed the remaining seeds into the garden and forgotten about them. Over the years, the resilient plant had taken root, cross-pollinated, and thrived in the Pacific Northwest climate, quietly expanding into a dense, fragrant jungle of feline narcotics. But that didn't explain why the bobcats were obsessed with Barnaby, or why they gathered on the patio doormat. Arthur turned slowly and looked at his domestic tabby, who was sitting innocently on the other side of the glass. Suddenly, the pieces fell into place. Barnaby had a doggy door, which Arthur had locked months ago when the bobcats arrived. But before they arrived, Barnaby had free roam. Arthur remembered finding Barnaby's favorite catnip stuffed mice, toys Arthur regularly soaked in fresh oils from the garden, scattered in the woods. Barnaby hadn't just been exploring. He had been unwittingly leaving a trail of the most potent, mind-altering, ultra-premium catnip the wild bobcat population had ever encountered. Barnaby was the Pablo Escobar of the local ecosystem. The bobcats hadn't come to Arthur's house seeking refuge from habitat destruction. They hadn't come just for the rotisserie chicken. They had followed the trail of premium narcotics straight to the source. And when they arrived, they found a massive, heated garage, a water source, and a glass door behind which sat the plump, smug kingpin who had brought the magic herb to the forest. They weren't looking at Barnaby with awe. They were waiting for him to open the dispensary. Arthur stood in the garden, looking from the sprawling catnip farm to the 20 heavily armed, completely stoned wildcats lounging on his lawn. He threw his head back and laughed until his ribs ached. Once Arthur realized he was running an accidental feline sanctuary/recreational dispensary, he knew he had to make things official. He couldn't just have 24 intoxicated predators roaming his property indefinitely without proper management. He contacted a reputable local wildlife conservation agency. When the field agents arrived, they were fully prepared to lecture an old man on the dangers of habituating wildlife. Instead, they found a meticulously maintained habitat, a perfectly healthy, thriving population of bobcats, and a man who could recite the dietary needs and behavioral quirks of Lynx rufus better than some of their interns. When Arthur showed them the massive catnip patch and explained Barnaby's role as the accidental drug lord of the forest, the lead biologist had to sit down on a patio chair to catch his breath from laughing. Working together, Arthur and the agency transformed his property into an official, protected micro-sanctuary. They established proper boundaries, gradually reduced the size of the catnip patch to prevent over-reliance, and used the property as a safe release site for other rehabilitated bobcats. Years later, Arthur sat in his favorite armchair. Barnaby, now considerably older and grayer, dozed peacefully on his lap. The lighting had changed drastically from that first sharp morning. Now it was late evening. The setting sun cast a rich, warm, golden amber light across the patio, softening the edges of the world and bathing the tall pines in a gentle, fiery glow. The air was warm, smelling of pine resin and blooming wildflowers. Outside, the patio was quiet, but not empty. Rufus, older and moving a bit slower, rested on the brick barbecue, his eyes half closed in the warm light. Madame Murder Mittens lay curled on the outdoor rug. And pacing the perimeter of the yard, sleek, powerful, and utterly confident, was Pip. The runt who had once stumbled over his own feet was now the undisputed king of the sanctuary, his silver-gray coat catching the last rays of the sun. What began as a single mysterious visitor had slowly evolved into something profound. It was a quiet bond between a man, a domestic tabby, and a family of wild hearts. Arthur looked out at the peaceful scene, feeling a deep, abiding warmth in his chest. He no longer saw them as wild strangers, but as an integral, unforgettable part of his life. A chaotic, hilarious, and beautiful gift that had found him exactly when he least expected it.